Hi, guys, and welcome to another edition of The Kevin Moore Show. Now, on today's show, I'm about to be joined by my guest, Devi Miriam. Now, Devi has been working in the interfaith field for over 20 years and founded the Global Peace Initiative for Women. Now, over the years, Devi has recalled many past lives, and she's recorded them in order to better understand the karmic patterns. Now, she shares her latest memoirs in her book, The Untold Story of Sita, an empowering tale of our time. Devi Miriam, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
It's great to have you on. Now, obviously, today we're going to talk about your latest book, The Untold Story of Sita. What a journey that you've been on. Where to start? Well, I think really, what caused you to, what drew you to write this book, The Untold Story of Sita, and what is the book about?
Well, I've had experiences over the past, say, 2, 3 decades where I have recalled past births, and I've written about them in my book, Journey Through Time. And I decided to publish that book when I realized that many people were having similar experiences, not as much detail, but having some sense of rebirth, and that it was a much more widely accepted reality today than it was, say, 10, 20 years ago. So I decided to do that book. And then I was in India visiting the temple town of Ayodhya. Now, the story of Sita is told in a book called the Ramayana, the story of Sri Ram and Sita. It's the foundational story of Indian civilization. It's, like talking about the Bible, really, the stories of Abraham and Sarah for the Abrahamic traditions. And yet I was never quite satisfied with the way it was told, because it's really the story about Ram with Sita as a supporting figure. And at the end of the book, for those who don't know the story, Sita is kidnapped, and then there's a war, and she's rescued by Ram. And then the citizens of Ayodhya demand that she be banished because she stayed away from, she stayed in another man, she was kidnapped. And that never made sense to me, because Ram is considered to be the epitome of Dharma, of righteous action. So when I was visiting Ayodhya, which was their kingdom, a few years ago, I began to be pulled back in time, as I've experienced so frequently and explained in my journey through time. And I began to see the story through Sita's eyes. And I think it's a very important retelling that needs to take place, because the story took place, and there's a lot of historical evidence for the story. There's a lot of historical evidence, but it took place, several thousand years BC, and it was in a pre-patriarchal era. So many of my scholar friends have told me, yes, that part about the banishment was added much later, after the patriarchy took hold. So I thought to myself, well, why did they feel the need to add that? And it's now time to unwrap this story and to really find out who Sita was. So that was my journey, to find out who Sita was as a full partner to Ram.
Wow, so many questions, right? How did you know that you were tuning into the Sita that you're writing about? I mean, what had you ever come across Sita before? I mean, had you come across her then you felt that you were the reincarnation, or I'm guessing you must have done, or
No, I tuned into a servant in the household. And so, with all my other past life recalls, I could tell that they were true by certain things in my life. But in this instance, I saw myself as a servant in the household of Sita,
so hang on, say that again. You tuned in to a servant
in the household,
in the house. What household was that?
in Sita's household. Before
S-
she even came to Ayodhya, there was a kingdom in ancient India called Mithila, and it was ruled by a very, very enlightened, I would say, or esteemed and highly regarded king, King Janak, who was Sita's father. And and the story is that there had been a drought on the land, and he had no children. He had been praying for a child, And then Sita is found in a field, and then he raises her, and he gives her all the access to the rishis, to the great sages of the time. So she receives a very highly spiritual education and gains many, many skills. And I saw myself, and whether I was truly that person or whether I was just channeling that person, I can't tell you, as a servant in that household. And so I was able to perceive things about Sita that are not told in the traditional narrative.
Right, right. So you projected the lifetime of the servant that served Sita.
Right.
Okay. Now, in obviously, then when you was in that, what do you call? Did you call it a castle that you was in? No,
A palace.
a palace. What's
Yeah.
the difference, right? Right. You was in a palace, and this palace is named after Sita now, or
Well, no, this is not named after Sita. The town of Ayodhya, where I visited a few years ago, where these images came to me, was Ram's kingdom. And the kingdom where Sita was born was a neighboring kingdom. And she was eventually married off to Ram. And some of the servants came with her from Attila. I was one of those servants, or I was channeling one of those servants. And then the servant eventually, she and Ram are forced to go into the forest to wander for 14 years. And many things happened during that time. And as the servant, I died, didn't see them return, but then was reborn in Ayodhya some years later after Sita had passed away. And so the story encompasses two lives of this servant. And so she gets a special view of Sita as a child, Sita as a young married woman. And then after she's reborn in Ayodhya, she hears stories of what happened to Sita when she returned. So it really highlights the fact that Sita was a, self-realized being, a Devi, a great rishi, a great sage, or, we would interpret that in different ways. And I think the point, and then along the story, there are many women sages that she meets. And I think that this is so important to bring back or to revive the memory of these women sages, because they're lost in time. The women are of that time, as they were recorded centuries later, are not told as great sages. They're recorded as the wives of. Sita is the wife of Sri Ram. Some of the women were the wives of the great rishis. So this presents the women as being equally important in the unfolding of the narrative.
absolutely. I mean, I've heard it again and again that one time on our planet, maybe very possibly, it was the women that were the leaders of the planet, not the men. Um,
Yes, I
Go
think.
ahead.
Yeah, I think in many societies that was the case, and I think many of the earliest images we have of deities are of female deities. But there's another important point to the story. According to the Eastern view of time, time moves in cycles, and that was a declining time. And it was a time when humanity was just beginning to see itself as separate from the natural world. And so this separation was causing many things, causing a certain sense of superiority and control of nature, and that forests could be cut down, animals could be killed. It was the loss of that harmonious state. Now, all traditions have a memory of a time when we lived in harmony with nature, the Garden of Eden. We look at that as myth, but in actuality, there was a time when humanity did not see itself as separate and above nature. It's we saw ourselves as part of this web of life, and there was a much greater understanding of interconnection and interdependence and how everything was carefully balanced. With that loss of knowledge, we've eventually come to where we are today, which is near destruction of the natural world. So I think that that's one of the main points of this book, is that to understand that we've come to this place, and we have to reclaim our unity with the rest of the natural world.
Were there any other sort of profound messages as well?
I think there's it's a story about rebalancing in terms of gender, rebalancing in terms of man's place in the world. And I think of the importance of gratitude. I mean, it's in Sita's world, there was enormous gratitude for the medicinal herbs that were everywhere, the wild plants that were everywhere. When she returned to Ayodhya with Ram, she chose to raise her sons in the forest so that they could have familiarity with all these things. So there was this gratitude, which is part of the sense of unity with the natural world. So I think there's the ecological message and there's the gender message that are the two key messages that are woven in throughout the story.
Okay, so when you went to the palace, obviously you knew that was the palace where Sita had been staying at. Yes.
Right. Yes.
Yes, yeah, yeah, yeah. And but you did not know, or did you know that you had any connection to her through any previous lifetime?
I didn't. It was after visiting that place that, as I sat in my meditation, because I've been a long time meditator, I would just be drawn back into the past, and I would see images and hear conversations. And because I know, I mean, according to my understanding, we have many, many incarnations, many, many lifetimes, and they go back quite far. And so what I've recorded in my first book were the more recent ones, going back to the last birth, which took place during World War II, and then before that, and before that. This was very far back in time. And even though I knew that I've been around for a long time, accessing those memories was really kind of astounding to me. It's like, where are those memories stored? And were they my memories, or was I channeling somebody else? Was I
Well,
channeling a servant? you know?
well, what is the difference between if they were your memories or if you were channeling them? I mean, really, do we really understand what channeling is? I mean, is channeling just like a funnel where you're opening the greater part of yourself up and accessing your higher self, where we think it's something else coming through, but you're only accessing a greater part of yourself, really?
But that was my conclusion. And at the beginning, I said to myself, people are going to think I'm crazy, saying that I had this life, thousands of years ago. And then I said to myself, what difference does it make? There were some profound truths that I was hearing, and I was having this experience of being with Sita, who was a holy, holy woman. And that was transformative for me. The experience of being, I came into an intimate relationship with her, and I did not have that. I mean, before this, she was somebody I read about in the Ramayana. There was just the story that I knew because it's such a foundational one for India, and there wasn't a personal relationship. But now I was having a personal relationship with her, and subsequently I was feeling her presence and her guidance in my life, and that was an enormous thing for me when I began to speak to her and feel her presence and feel that she was actually guiding things that were coming to me in my life as Dina today.
Right, right. And how would this process work? How did it work the first time then? Just explain that. I mean, what happened? Who was you with? Did you start speaking to someone else and, communicating that this was coming through, or was it just created, was it done through writing or?
Through writing. I mean, actually, I didn't tell anybody about this. I had the experience. I was with a few other friends when we went on this pilgrimage to Ayodhya, and I just became silent as we walked through the streets. I just withdrew myself as they were, visiting the various sites. This was Sita's kitchen. This was Sita's this. This is Hanuman's temple. He's one of the characters. And I just could not speak. And I said to myself, oh my God, I lived here. I know that I lived here. This is so familiar to me. I have some intimate relationship with this place. And so I dwelt in this kind of interior space. And then over the next many, many months, as I would sit in meditation, I would see this story emerge.
Wow. Um, and is that connection still with you, or was it only in some sort of sacred place where this was taking place for you?
No, it's still with me. I'm working on another book now, a follow-up to this book, which is the life of Rukmini, who was Krishna. You must know of Krishna, Krishna's wife, and she is said to be also the rebirth of Sita. It was about 2,000 years later. And so as soon as I finished the Sita book, I actually thought, well, there's nothing left for me to do. I've kind of like my life's work. I wrote these two books. And then this other story started coming to me of what happened when Sita was reborn as Rukmini. And oddly enough, there's nothing known about her because at that time, the women had totally receded into the background. So there's not much known about her. But a story is coming to me. I'm very much deep into the process of writing that book.
Thank you for sharing that. Now, obviously, I've touched over your book before this interview, and one thing that during the time of Sita that I read was, humanity was more sort of integrated into the natural world compared to where it is right now. So what sort of message did Sita have for where we are now, in a sense?
Well, according to the Eastern way of looking at time, as I mentioned, it's cyclical. And there are four eras. I mean, we talk about eras too. We talk about the Iron Age and the Bronze Age and the Stone Age. But we see time as linear. So there was a time in the Stone Age when people lived in caves. And then you moved into the Iron Age and the Bronze Age when tools were developed and all that. According to the Indian view of things, there was a higher age, Satya Yuga, and then a decline into the Treta Yuga, and then a further decline into the Dwapara Yuga, and then the darkest period, which was the Kali Yuga. So I've tried to reconcile these two views because it is related to the Sita story, because the story takes place during the Treta Yuga, which is the beginning of the decline. But according to the linear view of history, civilization developed. But what we're talking about is the development of the material civilization. And what the East is talking about is a decline of spiritual wisdom. So there may not have been many, luxuries and conveniences that we have today, but there may have been a much deeper understanding of the workings of the universe. For example, they could tell so much about time just through the movement of the stars. They recorded a lot through the movement of the stars. So this is all part of the loss of this knowledge is part of the decline, just as the loss of the understanding of the balance of the natural world. It's not just that we felt ourselves as separate. We lost the knowledge of the plants. We lost the knowledge of how nature keeps this exquisite balance. It's quite miraculous that everything functions as it is. And there's clearly some kind of innate intelligence. And, the Eastern mind saw an intelligence, a consciousness in the natural world, and saw that was what kept the balance. So we've lost that knowledge now. And so that's I'm hoping to sort of create a moment of reflection of how do we, in order to face the ecological crisis we are dealing with, and we are dealing with a very serious ecological crisis, how do we regain this knowledge that can help us rebalance the natural world?
Well, thank you for sharing that. And so when when you had this amazing experience of just writing, or I mean, you call it could be a form of creative writing, channeling. Most definitely, I could go there as well, or a past life recall. And as I said before, what is the difference really? But there was a dialogue there, wasn't there? You was actually speaking to her through the pen.
Yes, no question. There was dialogue.
And how much did she want to speak to you versus you able to ask her questions, in a sense? Was there a sort of fair trade?
Actually, I was mostly listening. But if a question would come into my mind, the answer would come. So it wasn't like I'm sitting with you and you're asking me a question and I'm responding. It was more of an internal dialogue. Um, uh, you know, I mean, sometimes I would just hear her words. And, one of the things, the lessons that I learned through my first book was the power of love. Because what is it we take with us when we leave our earthly body? The relationships, the power of love. And what I saw from Sita was this tremendous love she had, not just for her family and her husband, for the servants. There was this love relationship between all the villagers. I mean, they regarded her as their own, and for the natural world. I mean, there's a story in there of a tiger that's hunted, and how she tries to make peace between the tiger family and the human family. And she sees that as the beginning of this separation. This is toward the second part of the book. But it's this, again, what I got from my first book and from this book is this tremendous power of love. And that was the central message of the story of Sita in Ram, is this love for all creation.
Well, where did Sita's education start to sort of have this sort of have reached this sort of space in her life where she saw the world from love, where she loved herself, and she was able just to love others with unconditional acceptance of who they are, with no judgment, with obviously she had a lot of good qualities. Otherwise, your recall wouldn't have been so attractive for you to want to write this book.
Well, I mean, I think that she took birth because there was a need on the planet. Things were becoming unbalanced, and there was a message to be given to humanity. She took birth in the kingdom of King Janak because he was such a benevolent being. I mean, when there was a drought, he would go without food in order to make sure the villagers ate. So it was also a different model of we have a very because we know only later history, we don't really understand what human communities lived like in the earlier days. But there was very much a sense of the king being the father to the nation. I mean, we still use that term, but how many are truly that? Where he took care of the needs of the people, and he would go around. And it was the time of the beginning of the agricultural revolution. Previously, there'd been enough wild foods where there wasn't much need to plow the food. Human communities were not that large, and there was plenty of wild foods around. But as the human community grew, there was and the climate was changing, droughts were coming. There was a need for agriculture, and he was one of the pioneers. I mean, a lot of this is just deep in the collective memory. He developed a different kind of plow. He used irrigation. He actually even seeded the thought of democracy, of having villagers take charge of some of their local issues through these local councils. And so it was it was a time of innovation, of helping humanity begin a new chapter in the development of civilization. And Sita's role was to make sure that love was at the center of that. With Ram, it was Dharma, which was much more about setting up the institutions that would guide society, the institutions for justice. It was the organization of society. And with Sita, it was making sure that love was central to that organization.
And did her philosophy, her teaching, spread to other parts of her country as well, to influence many others?
Well, when she and Ram were forced into exile for 14 years to wander through the jungle, there was a kind of a superficial reason why that happened. One of his father's wives, he had 3 wives, wanted her son to become the king and not Ram, and so she forced his exile. But the true reason for that was to help bring this development to the rest of what we now know as the Indian subcontinent. They traveled all the way down into Lanka, and one of their jobs was the beginning of educational institutions being set up. The sages were setting up hermitages to preserve the Vedic knowledge, which had been passed down for centuries. And so they set up institutions of learning to pass this down. but there were still cannibal tribes in those jungles. And so what Ram and Sita did was he protected the sages and the hermitages from those tribes, and Sita brought to them the knowledge of agriculture. And so there was a kind of like a bringing into the civilizational space these tribes that had not yet advanced. So it was, it was the beginning of what we can know as history.
Absolutely. And what was some of the information that you discovered that wasn't in maybe history itself, had been kept out?
Well, it was known that their exile. Um, there's this superficial reason of the one of the wives wanting that, and that's how the story is told. There's not much delving into the deeper reason for why they had to wander 14 years through that whole space of what is now India. And it is known that they visited all the sages of that region. And I came to see, and it is known that there were these Rakshasa tribes, these man-eating tribes, but the story hasn't been pieced together in the way that I saw it. What this was to bring those places into the civilizational space that was to become India, and to set up some laws and to bring agriculture to those communities. All that I've just said, the pieces were not all put together. You're left to figure it out on your own, really, if you just read the traditional narrative.
What was one of your lessons as the servant in that lifetime then, in a sense? Did you get that sort of message?
I did, because I had a difficult life, a hard life. Felt very unloved as a child. My father from generations earlier had received a curse. And again, this was the time when words were of great significance. Curses and blessings were powerful. And there are many curses told throughout that book, which Sita tries to end that time. And that's where the kind of laws of justice come in to take the place of these curses by the sages. But my life was a struggle, and it was only when Sita arrived in the household and that I was given the opportunity to come close to her, that I understood what love was. And so she was the first one. And when I look back and see, caste issue became such an issue, the separation of castes in India, it wasn't that way at the beginning. People had their own functions. There were some who farmed, there were some who made jewelry. People had their own functions, but it was a unified society, and that unity was broken somewhere along the line. But Sita had love for the servants. I mean, she saw and made us feel that we were performing important functions in the household, and the household wouldn't function smoothly without our contribution. So that was a real awakening for me, to feel acceptance and love in the household.
But when she was banished, along with her husband, for the reasons that you've mentioned as well, what happened to you as a servant?
Well, there were four of us who came, and we had to stay there in Ayodhya. We couldn't accompany them. And she asked us to keep her presence there. And so every day we would lay out clothes for her, and we would talk to her. And she knew that the kingdom would be under attack with Ram's absence. And so she did many things to try to preserve her presence there, to try to keep the peace. It was a dark period, and I died. It was 14 years. I didn't live to see her return.
Okay, and then when you in the book talk about the death of Sita, where did that information come from then?
So I finished the first part of the book, which ends with my death. Sita is still, and Rama is still in the forest. I don't hear about her, kidnapping or any of that. And I just end with my death. And I thought that was the end of it. And then I began to, in my meditations, see a subsequent birth in Ayodhya, maybe 50 years later, when Sita has already died. And I go to one of the gurukulams, one of the schools that she had set up for girls, which was also a very novel thing, and hear the narrative told of Sita's kidnapping, and I can't believe it. And I say it wasn't true. Sita could not have been kidnapped. She had so many powers and strength. And then I eventually am able to find one of the old servants who's still alive. And the second part of the story is her narrative to me of what happened after my death, what happened to Sita when she returned, what happened to her along the journey, and she narrates what happened in the kidnapping and relates that that was by her own design, the kidnapping. And so the many things that came through the voice of this other servant who had survived.
What was the other servant's name? Did they give a name?
Soma was her name.
Soma. So
And
Soma
Soma.
came through, and okay. Well, let's continue the narrative with Soma then. So in a sense, you mentioned a kidnapping there. Whose kidnapping was that? Sita's.
Sita. So as it turns out, as they came toward the south of India, um, the king of Lanka, of what is now Sri Lanka, had taken control of that area, and he was threatening many of the sages, and his generals were brutal, and they were threatening the villages and the private life. And Ram was battling them, but he knew that at some point he would have to face the king of Lanka. But he couldn't attack him without a reason. He couldn't just go. I mean, that was one of the rules of law, that if you're attacked, you attacked, or if you're threatened, you can't just go attack. So Sita knew that she would have to go into the kingdom and give the rationale for Ram's attack, and also she knew that she would have to, because she saw who this king of Lanka was in his previous birth, and so she saw that she would have to go in and work from the inside. So she allowed herself to be kidnapped. Now that's not the way the story is told. The way the story is told traditionally is she's a victim. She's brutally kidnapped. Ram comes back heartbroken, raises an army, and rescues her. The way I saw the story is she allows herself to be kidnapped, giving Ram the reason to go attack Lanka, and he eventually defeats the king of Lanka and rids that whole area of these negative forces. But Sita works from the inside, working on his mind, getting him, trying to transform him, and then allowing Ram really to come in and do the final job of killing him.
And let's then move the story forward to well, what was actually Sita's last few days then? What was Sita's passing?
So then they come back to Ayodhya, and the traditional story ends there. They come back to Ayodhya. But later, an addition was that Ram has to again banish Sita to the forest because she had been kidnapped. She had lived in the palace of another man for 1 year. Now, that never made sense to me, and it doesn't make sense to a lot of people, although that's deep in the Indian psyche. You have village women who, for centuries, have been singing the Sita blues, how unfairly Sita was treated. And so the story that I heard was that after she came back, she got pregnant. She had was pregnant with the two sons. And for multiple reasons, one of them desiring her sons to grow up away from the palace, but in the forest, so that she could transmit the knowledge to them, she and Ram agree to this separation, and she goes to raise her sons in the forest. Now and then she dies an early death, and there's a reason for that that's told in the book. When during the Great War with Lanka, Ram's brother Lakshman is shot with a poison arrow, and the Lord of Death comes to take him. And at that time, Sita, who's in meditation, sees this and battles with death. And death says, I will let him come back to life, but I will take some years from you. And so she has this early death. And her work is done. She's done what she can to instill this sense of balance and harmony in the human community, this love for nature. And it's time for her to go. And there's a very beautiful story of her passing when Ram comes and he calls all the great beings, the sages and sages, to come pay homage to Sita. And it's then after that she dies while she's in meditation with him by her side. So it's a very different story than the traditional narrative, where she's sort of banished from society and becomes the victim of this terrible thing. Here she's honored, and Ram pays tribute to her for her many sacrifices. And then there's a beautiful story of her just dissolving into the universe.
So, what was some of Sita's unseen work then that was brought through in the communication that you had with her?
Well, there's the story of this this tiger that comes to her cottage, crying, crying, and crying, and then she sees that he's being hunted. She's being hunted, and she goes to the village. He being hunted because he had killed a little boy. She goes to that village, and the villagers are out to hunt the tiger. And she explains to the villagers that the tiger killed the little boy because one of the cubs had been shot by a hunter, but it wasn't a hunter from that village. So she is able to dissuade them from hunting, and she says to them, "Look, you are the forest keepers. You are a village in the forest. You have to maintain harmony with the animal and plant life." And so there's that story. There's another story of a woman, a young girl who's coming to the hermitage where she's staying, gets a blessing for her marriage, and she's brutally raped on the way. And Sita heals her, and then Sita says, "This is a new form of human behavior. There have always been incidences of this kind of thing, but it was for lust. Man couldn't control himself or whatever. This was for revenge, and this is a new kind of human behavior." And so she heals the woman, and conveys this to Ram. So a lot of it is she's guiding Ram on what kind of laws to establish. So he establishes the laws of protecting the forest. He establishes new laws for meting out justice, and so she's kind of a force behind him, uh, uh, which subsequently led him to set up a society based on certain laws, which had not existed before because there were more just tribal communities previously.
And obviously, Sita's work continued after that. What was the sort of fulfillment of her work as well, in a sense?
Well, there are many little incidents in the second part of the book, um, of some of the sages who had given out curses, who were trying to do penance for those curses that they had given out. Some of them wrongly given. And so one of her big achievements is to bring to an end the age of curses, and to establish Ram as the setter of laws, as opposed to sages who were no longer giving out curses based on justice, but based on their emotions, anger or whatever. And so she does a lot to help end that period, not totally, but for the most part. And she helps see the liberation of some of the great sages of old. So her work was helping Ram behind the scenes set the foundation for the civilizational foundation for a new society that was going to come into being through his efforts and then subsequent efforts by descendants. And so, but a lot of her work was behind the scenes, where she would do something and then convey to Ram what had happened, because she was like the eyes and ears. She could see what was going on
Yeah.
uh, among the people.
Now, how does this work fit in with some of the other work that you do? How is this all fitting together? Because I mean, is some of it, what is your sort of, what do you do? Let's get into that.
Well, I founded an organization called the Global Peace Initiative for Women, and its goal is, it was started by a group of women, but we moved. Our role is not so much in the area of gender now, than in the area of ecological balance. We feel that women do have a special role in bringing back ecological balance because of our deep connection to the earth. So I organize a lot of dialogues. I go to UN climate meetings and talk about the need to restore ecological balance, and talk about the shifts in mindset. In order to change behavior, you have to change your thinking. So what are the shifts in mindset that are needed? And interestingly, I've been doing this work now for some years. But the work that I've done with Sita informs this work, and I have come to understand more deeply why I'm doing the work that I'm doing. I've just been led into this understanding of what is needed to restore ecological balance and the role that women need to play in doing this.
Wow. Okay. Do you think by doing this type of book that you've just done, do you think that changes your perspective on so many things that it helps progress the work you're doing in some way?
Absolutely. I feel that I've been changed through the writing. The first book that I wrote was a transformative one for me because I got to see way into my past and saw that these themes that I'm working on now have been developing over many lifetimes. The work with the Sita book has shown me how I can best serve the Sacred Mother, whatever form that Sacred Mother takes. For me, she took the form of Sita. For someone else, it could be another form. How I can best serve that. And that is what my life is dedicated to. And a lot of that has to do with ecology now, and also, you know, creating a gender balance. Now, in writing this book, I got to see the role of Ram, who expressed the higher masculine energies. He was a man of such deep sense of justice and balance. And so I look and I say it's not just about furthering the women's role now. It's about also helping men be in the right balance with women. So it's about this both genders being able to articulate their higher energies and to be in balance with respect for one another.
Absolutely, absolutely. Um, I've heard you on a previous interview where you talked about the need for a lot of spiritual people as well right now. They turn off the news, they disregard what's going on, and it's all about just their present moment. And it's just about creating their own reality in a sense. And it's almost like we ignore the sort of suffering elsewhere sometimes. And I just don't know. I just don't know if I can always connect with that way of thinking sometimes in the spiritual field where we ignore others in that sense.
Well, I certainly don't. I mean, I think we're here to serve. I think people who are at the beginning of their spiritual practice, understandably, are very focused on their own issues, and how to make them, how to function better, how to achieve certain things. But after you've been at it for a long time, you realize that you're there to serve, and that you can't just keep your peace and your love to yourself, and that your greatest service is to bring it to the world. So I actually probably listen to the news a bit too much, and I have friends in the spiritual community who I have to tell them what's going on because they just don't want any part of it. And maybe some people can't handle it. I have to acknowledge that some people maybe find it too depressing and can't handle it. But my feeling is we're the witness. We have to witness it, and we have to both act in the world. I mean, that's the whole lesson of all of this. I mean, Sita and Ram, as Krishna tells Arjuna in the Bhagavad Gita, act. You're called to action, and action is Dharma. But at the same time, if you allow yourself to get too emotionally drained, you can't be of service. So how do you balance this? How do you stay aware and be present and be the witness and act, and not be too caught up? I mean, you must feel this too, living in the UK. Living in the US is very difficult right now. We see so many injustices. It seems like we're going backwards. And then I realized that there's something called collective karma, not just individual karma. There's a collective karma. And a nation has its own trajectory, its karma. And, we have done things as a collective that have not been so beneficial to the world. And we have to pay a price for that. And so, how do you help us work through that? We pay that price, and knowing that there'll be a better outcome somewhere down the line. It might not be the next election cycle, who knows? But we do our best to try to set ourselves at a better path.
Well, what I think is also so beautiful and important about your message is that, okay, well, let me ask you this with that question in mind as well. Can we all, do you think, tap into our past lives without having to go under hypnosis, and how beneficial is that?
I think many people have inklings. I think that there are many. If one is a reflective person, and if one looks at one's life mindfully, you see that there are things that clearly you've initiated before. There are relationships that are clearly not for the first time, not new relationships. But I don't think, unless, I mean, there are many stories of people who've gone under hypnosis and have benefited from it. Either they've had a tremendous fear that they couldn't understand and they couldn't cope with, and they've been able, through seeing a past life experience, release themselves from that. So there is some benefit if you do it with a skilled person. But I don't think it's necessary. I think that one gets the information that one needs. I think that the information came to me because I'm just another one of those who can say, this is real. I've had these experiences, I've checked them out. I mean, in my first book, I talk about going to the places that I saw, that I remembered, and finding the places that I remembered. So this is real, and I think that we're beginning to shift our worldview as a collective. I know in the U.S. they say that over a quarter of American Christians believe in rebirth. And that wasn't true a few decades ago. More and more people are having these experiences. And when I did interviews here for my first book, so many people called in, from all parts of the country, saying, I had this experience. Could it be real? And so I think that we have to trust our intuition. I think we get the information we need. It's not necessary. In fact, it was rather difficult for me to see and to re-experience some of the things I experienced in the past. I mean, there was a lot of pain involved in that.
And do you think you've cleared yourself of that pain now?
I think I have. I think I have.
What are the
I mean, I don't know if totally, but in a large, yeah.
and what do you think the benefits of that have been to you, in a sense? How do you feel different from that clearing?
Well, I'll give you a brief example. In the first book, Journey Through Time, I describe a life that I had in Africa. It was during the slave trade. There was a raid on the village. I was killed, and my sister and son were taken into slavery. And then I relate how after I was killed, I go looking for them, and I find myself on the boat, and I see my sister being thrown overboard. And that's all I record, right? Then that's the end of that story. Well, 2 years ago, a part of my work, we were doing a dialogue on racial healing in Charleston, South Carolina. And it was a mixed group, the Black community, some Black ministers, and a few of us from the North had come down. And it was several days of very painful dialogue because one of their Black pastors had been killed in a racist killing. And we had known that pastor, and so we were down there for that. And at the very end, one of the young men, the head of the Black Lives Matter, said, every year, once a year, we do this flower ceremony, throw flowers in the ocean to honor the Africans who died in the journey. You're invited to come. And so I went to that. And as I'm throwing flowers into the sea, I see the image of my African sister, and I realized I was never able to bring that to closure. And I felt her presence very keenly, and it was a closure for me. And some of the other white people with me said, we didn't belong there. That was a private affair. And I said, I belong there. I very much belong there. So if we could see our past, how much of these bitter divisions would change? If white supremacists could see that they had a life as a slave, and African Americans can see that they were white people in the past, how much would change, right?
Right, right. Or, Egyptians or whatever they may have been. Do you know what I mean? Whatever race.
As well as the
Yeah.
Palestinians. How do they know where they were in the past? It could have been reversed. And so, and this is what has led me, where my first peace dialogue was Palestine, Israel. For years, I went back and forth and I said to myself, who were these Israelis in the past? And who were these Palestinians in the past? Clearly, there's a karmic knot there that they can't untie. It's a cycle that they haven't broken loose from. And so my first interest was collectively, how do you break free of these karmic cycles. You're kind of caught in this hate thing. But I mean, it's easier to see it on a personal level. And so I've seen many instances where, when I went to that down to Charleston, I had no idea that was going to happen. And even when I said, yes, we'll go and throw flowers I had no idea it would have any personal significance for me, because that wasn't what was in my mind. I was thinking of the present, of this dialogue, and how can we, kind of ease the tensions in this community. And then I go there and suddenly it's a very personal thing for me.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's beautiful. What would you say then is the most important message of your work then?
The most important message is love. That's what I see is when we can see it all, then our victimhood, our anger goes away, because we realize that we've all been everything. We've all been rich and poor and this and that, and so we've had it all. And so what do we need to do in this life that can benefit humanity and help humanity move forward? And so I very much depend on the love that I receive from those I've known in the past, from the great teachers, from Sita. Those relationships are present. They're not just past relationships. And so it's the message of love, to realize the power and the importance of love to make a difference.
Absolutely, absolutely. And your website, Dina, is?
Well, my organization is the Global Peace Initiative of Women. The website is gpiw.org, and there's also Facebook and other social media formats.
Well, that's fantastic. Well, that website has been coming up on the screen throughout this interview. All links are in the description below as well, to your Facebook page and your books. And I'd just like to say, just thank you so much for coming on today.
And thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.